Continuing the Dwellers on the Nile, The Life, History, Religion, and the Literature of the Ancient Egyptians by E. A. Wallis Budge. And Chapter 5 is the Egyptian temples, what they considered to be their gods, and priests. And the Persia tree, and the tree which was the abode of the entity Nut, were always sacred trees in Egypt, and it has recently been shown that the trees now growing by the tombs of holy men in Egypt are believed to be the abodes of the spirits of Muslim saints, and to be holy. Some things are reappropriated, and some things there really is multiple people buried in some of these things. Trees. Or what was I thinking? W.S. Blackman in the Journal of Egyptian Archaeology, Volume 11, page 57. The tree trunk, which became associated with the worship of Osiris, is also survival of tree worship. Bakau, or the mountain of sunrise, and Manu, the mountain of sunset, were at all times sacred objects. Well, all things can be used as sacred objects, can't they? But it's different than dynamism, worshipping the things. And the creatures worshipped by the Egyptians, either for their power or because they were thought to be places of these entities considered to be gods and spirits, were among many, and many among them were. And the difference between a god and a demon, a lot of what's being talked about are jinn, but that doesn't mean it doesn't refer to something very specifically in a physical or psychological sense. Animal entities, the hippopotamus, demoness, Ta, Rut. The crocodile entity, Sabuk. The frog entity, Hukt. The hare entity, Wunun. The bull entities, Epis, Wr, and Butch. The ram entity, Ba. The lion entity, Mahas. The lynx entity, Ma'afadut. The cat entity, Bast. The jackal entity, Ginpu. The wolf entity, Upawat. The Ichnuman entity, Ka'atru. The Set animal entity, Okapi. Oh, they're questioning whether the animal was Okapi. The character of the donkey is doubtful, but he seems to have been a form of the sun entity. The shrew mouse and the hedgehog were also sacred animals. The plant forms, the animal forms, the mineral forms, yes, they represent something, but there are real subjective realities to the appearances of the spiritual realms. It's not all according to what is going to be pleasing or more identifiable to you. The holy doesn't necessarily work like that. But it can when it's best to. Well, it depends on what. But Bun, Nu, the phoenix, the vulture, Nrio, hawks of various kinds, the ibis, Habu, the swallow, Manitwur, or Manit, and geese of varying kinds. The following reptiles and insects were sacred: the turtle, Apch, the scorpion, Cirque, the beetle, Gspri, the Scarabus, Sacar, the serpent called Satay, the Carestes, the horned snake, and cobra. Yart, the praying mantis, and the grasshopper are mentioned in mythological texts. The Book of the Dead speaks of two fishes that probably were sacred: the ant, Yun. What's the fish? What sound does that make? I'll just say yunt, which announced the rise of the Nile, and the Abdu and Mahit was a fish entity. At first, all these were drawn in their natural forms, but early in the dynastic period, most of the animals, birds, and reptiles were depicted with human bodies, and heads alone indicating the original forms. Thus, the ram entity became the jackal entity, becomes the set animal entity, becomes the hawk entity, becomes the beetle entity, becomes the scarab entity, and so on. The sun entity has a disk on its head, the moon entity a crescent, the star entity a star, the mountain entity a range of hills, the serpent entity a serpent, and the Nile entity has a cluster of plants on his head and carries two vases, out of which he empties the Nile of the south and the Nile of the north. And we have Nemu fashioning a man on his potter wheel. Now, as I said, without the personifications and other sorts of limits, there can be a making oneness of all these entity names. And that is, various cultures did have that. They had, all one God. These are symbolic, much like names. So that was going on too. But there were also light beings and fire beings by which either people attached to them or knew of these things, that there was a spiritual presence in each thing. So we can't really say that isn't the case. That I believe that the very earth itself will testify. Even the inorganic earth will be able to testify. His head, plants on his head, carries two vases, which he empties the Nile of the south and the Nile of the north. Okay. The principal entities, the principal demons and demonesses of the dynastic period those considered gods and goddesses, right? Knemu was one of the oldest entities in Egypt, and his cult seems to have been in existence in the pre-dynastic period. His sacred animal was the flat-horned ram. He was the great builder, Knemu, of the universe. Okay, certain entities made strong claims at one time or another, so he made the entities and built up the cosmic egg from which sprang the sun, and he fashioned the first man out of the material which he created upon a potter's wheel. In a relief of the later period, we see behind him modeling a man on his wheel. Behind him is the ibis-headed entity Dahote, who is marking on a notched palm branch the years that man is destined to live. Xpre, the type of matter about to come into a state of inactivity. Nu, or Nuper, or Nunu, the primeval watery mass in which Xpre existed. His associate was the entity Nwut, or Nwut, a personification of moisture. Jahute, Thoth, represented the heart and mind of the creator of the world. By expressing in words the will of the creator, he made to come into being everything that exists, or so they say, right? He was the scribe of the entities and invented writing and mathematics and ordered times and seasons. His associate was the entity Ma'at, or Ma'at, the personification of physical and moral law. So Thoth, the scribe of the entities with his reed, palette, and other implements. Ptah of Memphis with the scepter of stability and serenity of the staff of rule, Huk, and the whip at the bottom of the back of his neck is the Metst amulet. Tum, or Ytum, Ytmu, who is always represented in the form of a man who is an ancient solar entity and was adopted by the priests of Heliopolis as the head of their great company of entities. And I'm going to leave this here to continue and hopefully finish tomorrow.